So just as a way to just kind of set the tone, you know, as the so-called psychedelic renaissance meets the global south, it's really important to understand what were the already existing networks that were in place prior to what we could say is a renaissance or a new phase in globalization, right? Or in some cases, people would rather use the term mainstreaming, right? The mainstreaming of psychedelics, making it into a normative within the Western capitalist liberal framework. So it's very important to understand what are those existing networks and what has been intensified through this new rush in interest, whether it be cultural, medical, legal. Who are the actors leading this so-called psychedelic renaissance? Who are the stakeholders and the gatekeepers? Where are they located? What languages are they speaking and who are they in dialogue with? What are the geographies being impacted? And what are the already existent political, economic, ecological, and cultural impacts? So, for example, every single one of these geographies is not just facing the implications of what the current mainstreaming of psychedelics might mean, culturally, ecologically, but these are communities that are already dealing with transnational mining, with agro-industrial projects, with other forms of political, economic, and social violence. So in what ways does this new drive in consumption add another layer of complexity and potential violence for these communities? How has philanthropy and capitalism become a coordinated force through projects in the global south, oftentimes using really beautiful progressive language to hide what might be new forms of settler colonialism, land displacement, and changes in land use and property ownership? What gets lost in translation, right? When we speak, obviously here we got Spanish and Portuguese, but Spanish and Portuguese leaves out other native languages, right, that don't get to participate in these forums. How is the agenda being set again, and by whom? And I'll just leave one final kind of example before we get into each person's intervention. I work in the area of peyote in San Luis Potosí, and while peyote is oftentimes said to be off the table because of cultural and legal reasons, my research has been showing that it's actually not off the table. It's very much on the table. And there's a lot of interesting discursive work that's being done to kind of shift our understandings of rights over peyote. So in the case of San Luis Potosí, we have transnational mining, we have agro-industry, but we have an increase in peyote extraction and projects often through philanthropy that are changing land use and creating new hostilities amongst the indigenous and non-indigenous people who live in these geographies who are otherwise allies. Right? And so it's important to also remember the campesinos, right, who are not necessarily indigenous, who are working class, who don't have power and are never in these forums because they're not necessarily the bearers of these traditions, but they live in these geographies and they can't be displaced either. And they might also be using these plants in their own ways. So what interventions are needed then to ensure free and informed consent, non-tokenizing dialogue, and a true equitable conversation on how the mainstreaming of psychedelics is impacting different places? So that's just to set the tone a little bit for today. And we're going to start with Nidia. If you could share with us how Mexico has incorporated peyote into its traditional medicine, and what are the main differences in the scientific approaches between the global north and the global south?
Okay, thank you, and good morning to everyone, and thank you to Chacruna for having me. I'm a historian, and I really like to look like the process and how the approaches to psychedelic change or not. So I think that the history of science is a good example to look these like colonial things or all the change in the approaches. And for example, historical studies of psychedelic science usually are focused in like how Germany and did psychopharmacology, chemistry, and anthropology, or like how botany in France, or like the developments in the United States, and it's interesting how usually the relation about all the studies about Mexico, I'm going to say Mexico, it's just usually show just like how only indigenous ritual uses, or like Mexico, we are just like drug traffickers, and that might be true, but we also did a lot of psychedelic science and developed different studies about this. It's interesting how like, especially peyote, because it's an endemic plant of Mexico, different scientists and anthropologists study these plants. And for example, if we saw what happened in 19th century about peyote, it was like a competition of white men who claimed to have discovered the peyote cactus and who focused on the botanical classification of these plants and the isolation of mescaline, that happened in 1898. But during the beginning of the 20th century, while Louis Lewin was writing his famous book Fantastica, or James Mooney was advocating for the sacramental use of peyote for the Native American church here in the US, in Mexico several studies were being carried out with this plant. It's important to emphasize that the local indigenous populations and other social groups in Mexico had an extensive knowledge about this plant, and which they had named and knew its properties. For example, psychoactive plants were analyzed in Mexican institutions to generate a national pharmacopoeia, and Mexican scientists, of course, were interested in the psychoactive effects of peyote, but also decided to register the uses given to this cactus in traditional and indigenous medicine that could benefit Mexican society. They, for example, they prescribe peyote as an ointment for pain, for rheumatism, for snake bites, burns, and others. And for example, Mexican pharmacopoeia prescribe peyote as a tincture, as a cardiac tonic, for example, taking out 30 drops 3 times a day. This dosage may not intend to induce psychoactive effects, but instead provide extra energy. Perhaps this was the first microdosing. So throughout to the 20th century, global neuroscientists focused mostly on the visual effects generated by peyote and preferred to use mescaline instead of the plant. And other researchers have noted that focus changed the approach to the plant, isolating the alkaloid, generate a product or a commodity, and in part forgo the cultural and sacred use of this cactus. Other thing that I want to highlight, for example, that a botanist, a Mexican botanist, Elia Bravo, that she was like very focused on the studies of the cactus. She was the person that classified these other Lophophora species, like Lophophora diffusa, like peyote hormigón, sleepy peyote, I don't know how to say, and no one says nothing about this, for example, and it's very important to look on these other scientists. But it's interesting to compare this different approach from the global north and from the global south, because some of the psychedelic science in the past and maybe now it's similar, led to the beginning of the desacralization and commodification of peyote. So that's what I want to say about this question.
Thank you. And I think, one thing that's really important that you mentioned is that there's already existing popular uses and that aren't, necessarily indigenous, right? This kind of...
They're like traditional medicine, and there are still these uses in Mexico of peyote, but I don't want to talk a lot about that because I don't want that more people extract peyote and use like but it's very useful to painful.
Yeah. But also the role of women scientists and how they get hidden, right, in this bigger story. So that's fantastic. Thank you, Nidia. Next we go to Citlali. How was the psychedelic movement lived in Huautla de Jimenez, Oaxaca? Those of you who aren't familiar with the geography, this is where Maria Sabina is from. How was the psychedelic lived in Huautla in the 1960s, and what are the current situations affecting the mushroom habitat in the Mazatec region?
Thank you, Diana, and a pleasure to be here with you, sharing this time and space with these wonderful, talented, intelligent people. I just want to say that Huautla, this town famous for Maria Sabina and all that, was a famous place in the countercultural culture. You know, it was a place of spiritual seeking, and was very, very important. So mushrooms, they are called shkon in Mazatec language. That is a word that has many meanings. It means sacred, it means delicate, it means powerful, dangerous. So that's all that grabs up what the mushroom experience is. And of course, sacred is that thing. It's powerful and it's dangerous also. So the mushrooms are part of this hidden realm. You don't speak about mushrooms from the Mazatec perspective. And it's also like the body of the mushroom, no? You see the fruit and the mycelium that is hidden. That's also what happens, for example, in the velada, the night ceremony. You know, this other world, this spiritual world, like you can see it, right? The hippies, and I mean like youth and people that were like impacted with the countercultural seeking and movement, they have also like this spiritual seeking, but also there was like this chaotic and very messy way of approaching to this medicine. So, the word for foragers in Mazatec language is chicon. And chicon is like the category for alterity, for the otherness. Chicon, for example, are also the lords of the mountain. It's like these entities that are like the real, they say dueños, that are the ones that have the ownership for rivers, caves, land, everything. So it's interesting that Chicon also are the light-headed people, and they call güeros, for example, in Espanol, they say güeros, even to me that I'm Mexican, I will be the güera. So that's the category. And that is interesting because also it's like that other world is inverse, you know, it's like the occult, dark place. And the way that these chicones, güeros, eat mushrooms was the inverse way that Mazatecs will do it. And that's very interesting because, you know, like there's an etiquette for eating these mushrooms. You obviously have to do diet, you have to isolate yourself from relations, you don't have to tell anybody you're doing this ceremony. You have to restrict sexually. And for example, also it's important you to be like in a mood, you know, and have an intention because you're doing a spiritual journey. You have to have an objective. So the hippies, the countercultural persons, just like eat mushrooms. Yeah, they were like seeking different things, but they were like this incarnation of craziness for the Mazatec people, and that's very interesting because they were like, okay. For one thing to be clarified is that not all Mazatecs eat mushrooms. That's a lie. But one of the things is that it's dangerous is that you can get crazy. And they were like this incarnation of craziness all over the town. And they're okay. they are like out of this world. And they were very criticized because they eat mushrooms at whatever time. And you have to do it like only at night. And for example, other thing, they eat it with honey, with sweets, with bread, and that's terrible. The mushrooms it's a sacred being, and you have to eat it with only your front teeth. You don't use the back of your mouth. That's unrespectful. And right now, like the status of the mushrooms is like there's a lot of scarcity. No, also the Huautla is like this cultural center right now, this cultural commerce center of the Mazatec Highlands, but it's also like this pillar of progress and modernity in Mazatec Highlands. So it has a lot of ecological problems, also because it's like more modernized, and there is a lot of scarcity right now with the mushrooms. Also, Mazatec people have to pay for mushrooms. That's also one of the consequences. And it's very difficult also to Mazatec people reach a real Chota Shine, a person who knows. So.
Thank you so much, Citlali. And I think one thing that you point out that's really interesting is this epistemic difference in how we understand mushrooms, in this case in the Mazatec tradition, as a being that you don't speak about, that you treat with a certain degree of respect, right? And so when we get into these new cultural uses, what are the impacts both for the Mazatecos, but what are the impacts also for these other groups of people, right? For them. So thank you. We are now going to move to my left with Bruno, and we're going to head to Brazil. How has the Brazilian ayahuasca scene influenced the iboga buitui rituals that are taking place in the country?
Thank you.
And that takes us also to West Africa.
Yeah, exactly. South-to-South relationships. Hello, everyone. It's nice to be here, to be with people also from the South and to exchange our knowledge. It's important too. I want to thank you, Chacruna, for inviting us. So I'm a psychologist. I've been working with ayahuasca and iboga and ibogaine for the last 15, 17 years. I used to work with ayahuasca to recover homeless people in the streets in São Paulo, a big city in Brazil. And I've been working with ibogaine in a hospital setting, and also helping Anima, that would be the healer, the shaman from West Africa, from Gabon, that comes to Brazil, and we've been organizing the Buiti initiation. So it's like a very different tradition from the indigenous use from the Americas, but also, Brazil, it's a place where we have this mix of many ethnicities, of very, very different populations that were brought there by force, enslaved. Also, indigenous people trying to survive from genocide. Also, people from the European countries. And all this mix, we say in Brazil, we mix everything. So we have a very rich and diverse religious tradition. So we have many different traditions, also different traditions of ayahuasca use. So we have dozens of indigenous groups that use ayahuasca traditionally, but also the main three ayahuasca religions that have been developed since the 90s. And also we have nowadays a wider diversity of ayahuasca use. I have seen all religious denominations using ayahuasca in Brazil, so a Buddhist, Taoist, Hinduist, evangelical preachers, everyone using ayahuasca. So we have this very interesting scenario in Brazil. I wouldn't say that it's all those ceremonies, they are, respectful, they are interesting. Many of them, they are practicing cultural appropriation. But also we have this Brazilian way of developing and doing things. And so I can say that this is also happening with the use of iboga in our country. So iboga, it comes from the Western Africa, from the region Gabon and Cameroon. It's a tradition that it's also many traditions inside one tradition. So we have like the iboga, we use the root bark of this plant that was kind of discovered, learned by the Pygmies, indigenous population from the region, and they thought about this use to many other groups in the region, and also in Brazil we have like a huge. So Brazil was the country that received most enslaved people from all America. So millions and millions of people was the country that took longer to end slavery. Also only 88. So we have a big suffering, a lot of prejudice, a lot of racism, but also we have all those cultural traditions that came from Africa embedded and intertwined into all the all Brazil, through all Brazil. So, well, that's happening also with iboga. So we have these traditions that are arriving there, but also mixing with ayahuasca tradition. So, and it's interesting. People are developing different ways of using iboga. So usually iboga, we would use this full dose, high dose, visionary dose on the first time that you take it. So it's like a rite of passage. And ayahuasca, you take it regularly. And iboga, you take it like when you help organize the ceremonies, you go for the ceremonies, you take just a little bit. That would be like a mini dose, not a micro dose, a small dose. And so it's so interesting, this rich development of different traditions. Also, people are taking more iboga and differently in Brazil. Also, iboga is now used also in therapeutic communities, using it in clinics. So it's also a new product offered in this market of, therapeutic cure offered for addiction. This brings also new different risks and also different possibilities to help people. So it's spreading through the country. And we have a lot of iboga and ibogaine used through the country. Each time more it's being used, but also people, many of those people, they don't get to know the Buiti tradition. We have almost anything written in Portuguese or even in English. It's almost everything in French. So people are connected with this more idyllic idea of Africa and the religious use. So, for example, in Brazil, we have the orishas, the candomblé. We have one way of that the African traditions arrived in Brazil, and Buiti is not connected with all that. But people are thinking that they are the same. So we can see this homogenization that's happening there in the same way that we can see people do in the global north. Know that when they get in contact with the traditions from the Americas, for indigenous people, they get just a little bit of that, and they think that they understood everything, and they think they know it all, and that's invisibilizing the tradition. So we can notice also these dynamics happening there in Brazil. So, well, I can say that this brings a lot of richness to all this development of this. So this is how the psychedelic renaissance is happening in Brazil. That's good for now. Okay.
Or you can spin it.
Yeah, that's it. So that's how psychedelic renaissance is happening in Brazil with those new opportunities and risks, and we can talk more about that later.
Well, thank you, Bruno, for giving us also a different geographic perspective of how the direction of the psychedelic movement is working, because we rarely hear of the South-South, and I think that there's a very important history about the connections between Africa and Brazil, right? And it's interesting to think of it manifesting itself in this way. So we now continue in Brazil with Lígia. What were some of the specificities of ethnocide in Brazil in the 20th century? And what is the role of ayahuasca and the forest medicines for recovering of indigenous identities in the last 20 years?
Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you guys for being with me today. Thank you Chacruna and all the Chacruna team. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. So my name is Lígia Platero. I am a queer woman, I'm a Brazilian queer woman. I am an historian and anthropologist. And I have been made research about indigenous groups since 2009 when I made my master's degree in Mexico. And in that situation, I studied about the policies from the state to indigenous people and things related to education from the 40s to the 70s. So is why I am interested about the discussions about ethnocide. And in Brazil, I have been studying about contemporary shamanic networks and indigenous urban networks with non-indigenous. So these relations amid indigenous groups from Pano family, from Brazil, from the Acre state, amid non-indigenous from the cities. So I've been working about ayahuasca, forest medicines like Cambo, Rapé, and Muka, and these networks in the cities, related also with the expansion of these forest medicines. And also I'm interested about the gender relations in this situation. So talking about some specificities about the ethnocide in Brazil in the 20s, first of all, the genocide, that is the killing of indigenous groups in Brazil, continued in the 20th century and also is continue also nowadays. But they stayed in the figure of the institution service of protection of the indigenous groups and localization of workers, of rural workers in Brazil. This institution had a very important play since 1910, trying to find and transform indigenous in Brazil into Brazilians. So the idea to the ethnocide is that the national culture, the white culture, is better than the indigenous, and they should transform indigenous groups into Brazilians, into white people in a cultural way. So it's like not kill, but kill the culture. So this was the policy, and the specificity of the SPI, protection of indigenous groups, was to create schools for learning Portuguese and trying to avoid indigenous groups to use indigenous languages. And they made a lot of alliances with like Catholic Church, but also with Summer Institute of Linguistics from the United States. There is a huge force from the 30s and 40s, and they also in Mexico they began to create these new technologies for learning the national language through the creation of alphabets in indigenous languages, so they could evangelize this group. So the evangelization was a huge force for the ethnocide in Brazil. And it's important to remember that now we are in the decade of the indigenous languages. ONU created this goal to preserve and bring again the indigenous languages in Brazil. So talking about the specificity of Pano group that is in Acre and Yawanawa indigenous people that I researched in my PhD, there are a huge presence of Protestants in this locate from New Tribes Mission, that is also from the United States. And also they avoided the Yawanawa to make shamanist practices, to have shamanist practices, because they say that it's a thing of the devil, because the shamans, the pajés, could also kill, not just heal, but also kill with their knowledge. So they are avoid to use their power and their practices. But in the 80s, the Yawanawa indigenous people began to fight against the presence of the Protestants, and also they began to have more different alliance, because in the Pano family they used to have a lot of exchanges amid of their groups, like Yawanawa making exchanges with the Huniquin, with the Shawanawa, with the Nokekoi. They have a lot of exchange intermarriages, and they have a lot of exchanges of cultures. Of the shamanism is everything is exchanged. They have a lot of exchange in the politics, in intermarriage, and the Yawanawa began to do these interrelations not only with Amiden, but also with anthropologists and people from the cities. So in the 80s and the 90s, the Yawanawa began to recover their shamanic practices, making their festivals, and it was an important force for them by recovering the consume of ayahuasca that have a very important play for recovering memories. So the pajés became to drink ayahuasca again and became to remember ancient songs, and also they began to do again the rituals, the festivals, and it was very interesting that in the 2000s, they began to go to the cities and make relations with non-Indigenous people. So they began to do these new relations and actualize their own traditions, their own ways to make alliances and exchanges, but now with non-Indigenous. So they began to receive in their own lands the non-Indigenous, and also began to negotiate rituals in the cities. And how Bruno says, in Brazil, there's a lot of mixes and hybridism. So in Brazil, for example, the Santo Daime began to transform their own rituals related to that. But I just want to reinforce that since the 2000s and also in the last decade, it was a huge increasing of the shamanic tourism in the Yawanawa indigenous people, but not just there, but also other groups in Acre, a lot of Huniquin, Shawanawa, Onokekoi, and it's like a big situation of the indigenous tourism there, and increase also the situations related to the possibility of cultural appropriation and commodification of their sacred plants. So it's an important topic to discuss too. Thank you very much.
So I think, really thinking about what are the old and new alliances, what are the old and new forms of violences, and also what are the capacity for kind of building new forms of traditions, right, through indigenous resurgence. So we're going to continue in Brazil. We're going to move to our last specific question, and then we're going to do some collective questions that we have also laid out. Marcelo, you're going to take us to another plant that is less popular. So what has been the role of Jurema in the struggle of Brazil's northeastern indigenous peoples for recognition of their cultures and territories? And why hasn't the entheogenic beverage, vinho da Jurema, never obtained the same reputation as ayahuasca?
Thank you, Diana. Hi, everybody. Nice to be here. And thanks to Chacruna, especially to Lígia and Clancy, good friends of mine. I'm here today on the stage. I normally am there taking notes. I'm a journalist. I'm a science journalist, not a scholar. And I've been writing about psychedelics for the past 7 years after the conference, Psychedelic Science Conference in Oakland. And I got hooked on the subject. And by Brazilian researchers and friends such as Bruno. And then I wrote a book about the Brazilian psychedelic science. It's called Psychonauts, Trips with the Brazilian Psychedelic Science, which came out in 2021. And I also write a blog called Virada Psicodélica, sort of psychedelic turnaround or something like that. And for the daily newspaper Folha de São Paulo, which is the leading daily newspaper in Brazil. And, Jurema, I don't know how many of you have heard of it, Jurema Preta, is the name in Portuguese, black Jurema. It's the plant, the scientific name is Mimosa tenuiflora. And I've learned from Nidia, I guess, that it's also present in Mexico, Tepescohuite. And yeah, it's a shrub tree, a small tree that grows in the very dry region of Brazil, the northeast of Brazil, nothing to do with the Amazon. And very common in the Caatinga. The biome is called Caatinga, which in Tupi language means white woods, Mata Branca. And it's been used by indigenous peoples in the northeast of Brazil since immemorial times, for centuries for sure, probably millennia. And there are some records, for instance, from the 17th century by the Inquisition and the Catholic Church and also chronists, that there was a sort of devilish beverage that was used by sorcerers and gave them visions and this kind of stuff. So it was pretty much repressed in the same way that Lígia just told you. So the cultures, the religion, the use, this ceremonial use of Jurema preta, also called Jurema wine, as they call the beverage. It's been repressed pretty much effectively in the case of the Northeast, because from dozens of people that were there in the northeastern part of Brazil, most of them got pretty much extinct, at least culturally extinct. And for you, just give you an example, just one people, the Funio, were able to retain their language in the northeastern part of it, from dozens of different peoples. They are now coming back in many ways, but they speak Portuguese, and some of them, which have come from a Tupi-Guarani origin, they are relearning the Tupi language in order to bring it back to their children. They are teaching Tupi in their schools. So what happened with Jurema, with the use of Jurema? During this period of repression, of cultural repression, it's sort of disappeared, but not actually. What happened is that more or less in the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, there was a new religion or coming up in the northeastern part of Brazil called Catimbó. Catimbó is a very syncretic religion that brings together especially native Brazilian origins, but also African rituals, entities, deities, but also European, Iberian sorcery and Catholicism. So it's very, very syncretic. And this Catimbó was also pretty much repressed in the first half of the 20th century. People, the juremeiros, as they call it, or catimbozeiros, were imprisoned for sorcery, and it was very common. There are some newspaper stories that tell horrific situations of people getting arrested for that. But it was there. The religion was there, and pretty much a reference to indigenous practices, and also African deities come in between. The very way Bruno and Lígia were talking about this kind of cultural blender that Brazil is, in a sense. And what happened is that more or less in the middle of the 20th century, this religion came under the umbrella of Umbanda, which is another African origin religion in Brazil, mixed up with Kardexism, so a bit complicated. But this religion, Umbanda, was officialized, there were federations of Umbanda practitioners and so, and they sort of, Jurema Sagrado or Catimbó came under this umbrella and became, so to say, legalized. So the repression started to be less so powerful. And, well, referring to the second question that Diana just asked, why is Jurema, or the Jurema wine, not so well known as ayahuasca, for instance? Not least in Brazil. I myself had been writing about psychedelics for years when I first heard of Jurema Preta and the use of Jurema Preta, which, by the way, contains DMT, which is the same substance in ayahuasca, one of the substances in ayahuasca. And they use it, the roots, in the same case as iboga. They use just the roots to extract the wine. And after much research and interviews, 3 years writing another book about Jurema that's about to come out this year, hopefully, I came to the conclusion that one of the reasons probably is that the northeastern indigenous peoples of Brazil, they do not fit the stereotype of indigenous peoples. They use normal clothes, they wear normal clothes, they don't speak an indigenous language with the exception of the Funio, and they don't look like indigenous people. They are very miscegenated. I went to indigenous territories in the state of Paraíba, for instance, where many people we would actually classify them as blacks. But they find themselves, they qualify themselves as indigenous. They belong to the community where indigenous roots are strong. They practice the cachimbo, the rituals with Jurema, and so on. And I think that's the main reason why in Brazil Jurema did not become so widespread, at least in the imaginary, in the conscience of the country, as much important culturally a beverage as is the case of ayahuasca. But they are not in the rainforest, you know. They are in a very dry place, very poor place. They don't wear feathers. They don't go naked around, and so they are not seen as indigenous people. And only in the more or less in the middle of the 20th century, became a movement of so-called reemergence of indigenous peoples in the Northeast. And Jurema, and the use of Jurema, and the circular dance called Toré became the two most important aspects of the culture that the Service for the Protection of Indigenous Peoples would recognize them, and later FUNAI, the present agency in care of indigenous people in Brazil. These were the two factors that they had to practice in order to be recognized as indigenous peoples, and became their lands back. It was also a requisite for land recognition and declaration of indigenous lands in the northeastern part of Brazil. That's it.
Obrigado. So, you know, and this, you bring up something very important, right? And right now we're going to move into, there's kind of shorter response questions. But I think, you know, especially in the global north, but also in the global south, there's perceptions around racialized subjects and what, you know, what is expected. And I think there's been a lot of work to think more generously about the history of genocide and violence and how that has transformed different regions at different times, but also the importance that we've seen, for example, in Mexico and Colombia and Brazil recently, of people of African descent being able to have a status as indigenous peoples, which allows also access to land rights. And so it's interesting to think of the role that these sacred plants, entheogens, might play, not just in kind of the imaginary, right, of the global north and urban elites of the global south, but also how it's been used as a tool for, you know, resurgence and kind of rebuilding a lot of the networks that had been lost because of violence. So, you know, on that note, right now we're going to do, and everybody doesn't need to answer it, just whoever wants to, but maybe this one everybody will. What are some of the ways in which this, what we call the psychedelic renaissance or the mainstreaming mainstreaming of psychedelics, what are some of the ways in which it's been manifested in Mexico and Brazil? And maybe more specifically, what are the consequences of the globalization of these plants for Mexico and Brazil?
I want to say something. I think that first, this idea of psychedelic is, of course, from the global north, so it's like another concepts that there are in Mexico, for example, like entheogens, that I'm not completely agree with that. It depends on the context, but this is a movement that it's from the global north, and of course there are like some psychedelic societies and psychedelic science and movements in Mexico, but there are very different approach. I think, for example, in Mexico, it's mainly because, for example, drug activism is more focused on like bigger problems like inequalities, that violence. For example, even advocating for cannabis, that is still illegal in Mexico. So I think this is a difference. And even though Mexico are endemic psychedelics, a lot of moralistic ideas persist. Little progress has been made on the regulation of cannabis, and the discussions about decriminalization of psychedelics have generated controversy, and discussions around, for example, biopiracy, commodification, and cultural appropriation of indigenous uses, specifically or in the issue of peyote. Activists are focused more on other immediate issues, like such defending their lands against extractivism projects like minery from Canada or other countries, displacement and violence in communities, and inequalities that does not entirely coincide with the aspiration of the psychedelic movement from the global north. And additionally, this part of the medicalization perspective has had influence in some sectors, more like elites in Mexico, but this perspective is still like foreign to most of the population in Mexico. This, I think, likely because of how psychological issues are understood and dealt with in Mexico and, for example, in the US, and because traditional medicine and ritual practices still have a strong presence in Mexico. And this perspective like clashes with the medicalization and the psychedelic renaissance that has developed mainly from the global north.
And thank you for reminding us of the problem of drug trafficking and what it is that people are living. And how priorities get made differently, right? And so it's very interesting that the same communities that are part of the psychedelic renaissance, such as the Wixárika or other groups of people, are also the people who are most being impacted by drug violence, right? Which has a whole connection to the north. So these are really important things that don't get talked about in the sphere of psychedelics.
Yeah, there are more important issues like poverty that not like to deal with trauma. I mean, all are important problems, but there are different approaches.
Yeah. Anybody else want to talk about?
Yeah, I would like to say, well, I don't know its consequences, but dangers also, because I think that, for example, one of the things or the issue is to reduce Mazatec people to mushrooms. Like Mazatecs are only mushrooms, and that the poverty, for example, was something that hit me when I came to do my research field. Was poverty. It was not like mushrooms and all that. And I think that also the thing that Bruno was saying about homogenization, it's very important because Mazatec people are diversity. Each town has its own history, language. For example, there are 20 Mazatec language, and 10 variants of that language. It's a lot. It's a tonal language also. So, I mean, and everybody also reduced the Mazatec Highlands to Huautla, this center of political, economical, cultural center. So, also invisibilize other towns that also have its own richness, its own practices. And also, I think there's a mindset for this mushroom ceremony. People think that there's a Mazatec way. Of course, there are forms and practice, but each chotashine, each person of knowledge has its own way. that it's impact because of, or it's made by his own life, you know, like he's migrant, and or maybe he work in the city and then come back, and I mean it's people, and I think that the global north like tends to idolize and romanticize this idea of the shaman, you know, and also like when you go there, you can see like all the complexity, because Mazatec is a people of really good commerce people, merchants, and also they have strong relation with Mexico City and with Puebla, and they are people that are traveling all the time, you know. So I think that that's one of the dangerous thing to do.
Thank you so much. It's so important not to forget that every single tribal community is a heterogeneous community, and that's very, very important. Anybody else?
Yeah, I want to comment more on that about poverty and drug trafficking, etc. Because yeah, I agree, it's something much more important for many people in our countries. But sometimes the psychedelic scene kind of occupied the space, and people stop discussing, well, drug policy and etc. So it happened to me once. I was already working with ibogaine for a long time, and I used to work in a place in São Paulo that was called Cracolândia. It's like a place with hundreds, crackland, hundreds of drug users, but there are people, poor people with problems with criminal justice, without an adequate education, so they don't access the work market, they can't find jobs, and there's a lot of stigma. So a lot of many different problems together, creating a lot of exclusion and stigma. And then the mayor invited us for a meeting because he wanted to give ibogaine to people on the streets. And said, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. Because he wanted, of course, to be reelected, because he wanted to show a new idea that would revolutionize and solve everything. And then we said, well, that's a good idea, but you need to give them a house and a job and solve their problems with the justice. And then he decided not to do that. It was too complicated. So I think that's interesting for us to think about this. How much is this psychedelic scenario is going to really revolutionize all that, and how much are we open to fight for all that too, you know? And so, well, just this small story on that.
A more positive tone on the debate. I think that the psychedelic renaissance can also have a positive effect in Brazil, at least, because it comes with the approval stamp of science. And this has some problems, we know, medicalization, cultural appropriation, and no recognition for indigenous rights and traditional knowledge and all that. But in a way, it might help to diminish the prejudice against, first, psychedelics, of course, ayahuasca and other stuffs, but maybe also with drugs in general. And because of this positive aspect, the therapeutic effect side of it, I'm always intrigued by the fact that the conservative part of Brazil, which is very strong, as you know, we had Bolsonaro, our own, the Trump to call ourselves, and these guys are very much focused on marijuana, and against it, of course. And it's illegal in Brazil. They are trying even to make it more illegal than it already is in the Senate in Brazil. But for some reason, probably because of the stamp of science, they do not care about psychedelics. They are not fighting against it. It's curious because when I started the blog or wrote the book, I kind of expected to have some backlash or some flack from the conservative side. It never happened, with a few exceptions. It's interesting.
So then would marijuana not be considered a psychedelic in this case?
No.
Without
normally,
the stamp
no.
of science?
Some people would say it's a psychedelic in high doses, but normally, no.
Just checking.
Yeah. I would like to make a comment too about how the psychedelic renaissance in global north has impact in Brazil, I see the increasing of the shamanic tourism, because there are a lot of people from global north going there to these festivals, for example, in Acre, and there are lots of people from United States, Canada, and Europe going to these festivals, bringing money, buying their jewelry, they're making a lot of, producing a lot of transformations in these cultures. And so these cultures have been actualizing their own traditions in these new relations. So how I talked in the beginning, a lot of white people in indigenous lands, and it's can be dangerous because there is a lot of people that can produce biopiracy, how do you say that? Mm-hmm. Biopiracy, and also people that goes there making a diet and come back to their countries and think they're shamans and make, okay, you can be a therapist, but you are not a shaman. So I was talking with Adana Cambeva yesterday. She will speak today, and she was talking about that. They can be therapists with some shamanic knowledge, but they are not shamans. And we have to respect a lot the shamans and the pajés in the indigenous people. They are recognized by the group, by their people. They're not shamans because they say that they are. So I think that, yeah, these aspects about also not just cultural appropriation, but the commodification, because the indigenous groups are transforming a lot their cultures and selling their medicines in these rituals in the cities, and yeah, it probably can bring a lot of different problems, no? So yeah, just thinking a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I think this will be a good segue to the next question, and this is just also an alert. Start thinking about your own questions that you want to pose our panelists. So on that note, what kinds of conflicts and controversies occur in intercultural spaces related to the consumption of these plants? What kinds of conflicts and controversies occur in intercultural spaces related to the consumption of these plants?
Well, thinking with Lígia, I think that well, this is an issue that it's like a main theme, the way that we consume, we approach to these medicines, right? Since our background and all that, and then this interchange between Mazatec people and, for example, tourists, psychonauts, and all that. It's also a very interesting and rich interchange. But I think that sometimes, like, the tourists or Westerns, like, have this mindset that the ceremony should be this way or that way, and they have all like a frame, and it's like a little bit messy in that place, because, you know, when you think, for example, in the Mazatec experience, this other world that just unfolds, they call this, or they talk about this experience like, I've been in a China's temple, I've been to Egypt, so it's like, whoa, what's happening there? Everything is in the other world, right? And well, it's an interesting mixture, but also we can see like the Mazatec gets information also from that people. You know, they can see where they come from. There's also like a spiritual connection that they could see how's the world of that person. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's like also this kind of appropriation and things are an issue, because people want to learn how to be a shaman. You know, these programs and all that, and it's, if you tell that to the Mazatec people, they just laughed. Like, I mean, to be a shaman or people of knowledge, it's a decision of life, and you are going to carry out that, I don't know, like that work all your life. You're going to be learning, so it's not something that you take a course 1 year, 2 years, and now you're a shaman. So I mean, that's one of the main issues.
Yeah, for example, in peyote issue, it's like, how I would say, all the environmental laws, because it's a plant in risk of extinction, and additional all this like cultural appropriation, medicalization. I think it could have like a negative impact in communities with traditional use. And about these tourists, there is interesting how a lot of people from the global north are going to Mexico to doing business, create their retreats, and not all, but mostly they regards to the social norms in these regions who are trying to impose their own cultural and economic practices, who are appropriating traditional knowledge and sometimes even indigenous identities. Sometimes they think that they are indigenous and they don't really suffer all the inequalities and poverties that it's not that they use psychedelics. There are different contexts that they have to live, and sometimes giving nothing back to these communities. So I think it's important to not repeat this thing of taking without giving to these communities.
Yeah.
I was thinking about some conflicts and misunderstandings related to gender relations. For example, in the festivals in the Yawanawa indigenous people, there are games, there are traditional games for the Yawanawa, and it's like there are people from other indigenous people, other indigenous groups that came there, and also white people, and there are two groups, men and women, and their play is that they have to imitate animals, and in a moment in the game, the men will run into the women and you try to touch a part of their bodies, and the women have to run into the men and hit them. So this is a play. So they, in traditional way, they in the same generation, men and women from different villages could approximate to maybe have marriage. So, and these games have been doing nowadays, and there are, for example, women from United States, from different countries, and sometimes it happens and they feel like they had a situation of sexual abuse. I saw in a situation when a woman was touched, and she was crying, and so the leadership had to talk with her and calm her and explain that this for her, this for the group, it's a tradition. So many people in Western goes to this shamanic tourism, and then they really don't know anything about these cultures, and sometimes they can have these situations of misunderstandings. And for example, I saw a lot of women from United States that get naked, just take their clothes because just this part of the clothes, because they think that they don't use clothes, but actually the women, the Yawanawa women have large hairs and they put here. So they also don't want to show a lot of their body. So I saw like women from the United States like naked, and also obviously the men can have a bad bad response. Some bad situations can happen. So yeah, I think that these misunderstandings in the shamanic tourism are important to people that want to go there and have a shamanic experience.
I'm so glad you brought in gender, because I think in these intercultural experiences, a lot comes up with respect to gender, and we've seen it in the Wijarika case where there's even assumptions from the outside about the roles that Wijarika women and men might have, or the Native American Church of Mexico has very strict gender binaries that don't exist in Wijarika culture. So it's very fascinating to see how the intercultural also has a gendered and a race and all of these aspects. Do Marcelo, Bruno, do you want to respond to this question at all? Or?
About Jurema, there is some conflict nowadays between I can recognize maybe 3 groups that use Jurema nowadays in Brazil. One is the indigenous peoples that are either using or going back to use Jurema as a way to affirm ethnicity and so on. Then there is also the Juremeiros, which are the heirs of Catimbó, this other syncretized or religion. And there are the neo-shamanic groups that I haven't mentioned, but it's becoming popular between these guys to use Jurema together with Syrian rue. It's a plant that's not Brazilian, of course, as the name says, it's from the Middle East. But it brings the inhibitor that is very important for the DMT to have this effect. And there's the tension between these groups, especially from the two first ones with the neo-shamanic circles, is that they claim that they are disrespecting the plant because they are just for the fun. They are using it just to get high, to get inebriated. And this is our sacrament from our religion, so it's not okay to do that. And the curious part of it is that the Jurema wine nowadays has no psychedelic effect, in spite, the traditional use, because they don't use a plant that has an inhibitor. But in spite of that, they get into a trance, and they communicate with that people. They call it masters of Jurema, or caboclos, which is ancient indigenous spirits. And these guys live in cities and realms, not in the astral, but somewhere. And so it's very serious for them. They take the Jurema wine to get in this trance without psychedelic effect. And the other guys take Jurema with psychedelic effect to get high. So they are really disputing about that.
Well, just going to comment on that part on gender too. In Brazil, we have nowadays a lot of sexual abuse happening. People are discussing about that and how to prevent that from happening. On indigenous shamans, also we have this difference on understanding the relationship. So, for example, an indigenous shaman said, "No, but it was not an abuse. It was just a nipple." For him, maybe it's different, but how can we create this dialogue to really prevent those things? And in Brazil, we have a lot of discussion on that. So we have, as I said, many different religious traditions using ayahuasca, many, self-considered shamans, and a lot of problems happening around that too. I think it's important to talk about that, and also to talk about how this is being discussed on social media. I think there's a lot of impact also on that. It's an important movement happening nowadays.
I want to ask another question because, of course, it's important to have a global North, global South dialogue, but it's also important to remember that there can be South-South dialogues and that those are often marginalized or not of interest. So I'd be curious, what experiences do you see in a South-South approach in this resurgence of interest in psychedelics and plants?
When I heard in this panel, I find a lot of similarities. Like, for example, like the policies of the state in Brazil and in Mexico, it was very similar, that they try to homogenize the indigenous population. So I think it's a thing. And for example, what you say about Jurema and how the Inquisition prohibited the plant, it was very similar in Mexico with peyote. The Inquisition say that it's a root, that it's the influence of the demon, that it's an idolatry. So I think this is a lot of similarities that we have to talk more about that, to try to construct and to, because there's not usually discussion from Brazil to Mexico, mainly because the language, but I think this is a panel that we could learn a lot about the similarities and the difference, and try to work about and the traditional uses that we have some of the same plants, no? So that's a very interesting thing to look on the different uses of the plants in Brazil and in Mexico, for example.
I have a question for her. Tepiscuite is a medicinal plant, right? But not an entheogen.
No, because the
In Mexico.
inhibitor that you say, the people use more for
Topical.
topical. Yeah, that's interesting. But now in the psychedelic renaissance in Mexico, there are people that they are making DMT from tepescohuite. Yeah.
But it's a very popular,
Yeah.
topical.
Yeah, it's very common for burn. If you have a burn or something,
Yeah.
you could use very cheap to buy a ointment or cream of tepescohuite.
Interestingly, as far as I know, it's not used that way in Brazil.
Yeah, no, that I think it's recent that it's the psychedelic uses. I'm not really sure, but it's a recent thing.
Also, what Marcelo was sharing, that many people don't know about these plants. Also, we found that in Mexico, many people just don't know about mushrooms, or they're not in this movement. And also, there's also this, rejection for that. And now there's a new proposal for legislation. And it's a very chaotic thing in Mexico, because the president we have now is extracting, I would say, symbols of indigenous people and using it to manipulate people. So that's a main issue. But for example, it's popular, but we have a problem also with representation for indigenous people. I think that's a big issue, because they go and search for leaders, indigenous leaders, and that's very difficult, because maybe there's a person representing Mazatec or whatever other culture, and maybe people in that town, they say, that person don't represent me. So that's an issue, and it's a lot of tension. And other thing is that, for example, all this commerce and commodity about the mushroom, it's a tension that exists. The tension between modernity and traditional way of life, it's incarnated. It's in day life with the people. They're fighting with this all the time. And well, I think that also it's very dangerous that politicians use people's or town symbols to manipulate. That's a big issue.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to mention the dialogues amid Brazil and Mexico related to ayahuasca Brazilian religions, because there are a huge presence of Santo Daime in Mexico. So in these contemporary shamanic networks and urban shamanic networks, there are a lot of dialogues amid Brazil and Mexico. So these networks are international. They are not just national. In Mexico, there is not so strong, of course, as Brazil, but there are a lot of Santo Daime Church there, and also they replicate a lot of things that is happening in Brazil. And there are different lines of Santo Daime, this ayahuasca Brazilian religion in Brazil, and they bring padrinos and madrinas, and they bring a lot of leaders from Brazil to have rituals in Mexico. And also, for example, they bring Yawanawa. When something begins to grow in Brazil, like Yawanawa, tal. So they want to show them. They want to bring them there and also make rituals. And of course, there are a lot of different dialogues. The other side is equal. Things related to peyote. A lot of Brazilians like to bring Wiharika people to Brazil and to make rituals in these alliances from the medicines. So, and also in Santo Daime Church in Mexico, there are a lot of rituals with peyote, with the Mazatecs. They replicate, and it's similar, this idea to make dialogues amid Santo Daime and in the indigenous groups, and to recreate some hybrid rituals. So there is a lot of dialogues and multiple directions and interactions.
And I think I want to add, it's very interesting, those of you, in Mexico, it's become very popular on social media to see, especially in resort areas like Puerto Vallarta or Tulum, places like Tepoztlan, but also in kind of upper class communities, suburban communities of Mexico City and Guadalajara, ceremonies that bring ayahuasca, peyote, cambo, ufo, all in one setting, right? It's a buffet. It's a 4-course meal, whatever you want to call it. It's a very elite situation, but that is a very conflictive situation because they do bring quote unquote shamans to orchestrate those activities, and there's very little transparency, I think, oftentimes, in how this is being done, so there can be harm, there can be dangers, but it also might mean that shaman, when they go back to their community, is ostracized because they're making money off the culture. And the white folks in the cities don't see that, a lot of times. So, Bruno, did you want to add anything to the intercultural piece?
Not.
Okay, we have questions from the audience. Danielle, you want to?
Sure. I do want to take Marcelo's microphone, so let's just try to gather questions, and if I need to repeat it, I'll do that.
Okay.
You want to start over here?
Sure.
So I have a question about non-Indigenous use of sacred plants or sacred ceremonies, right? So I'm wondering, I'd like to hear from the panelists as a whole and separately, what would be your optimal? Would it be that people come and study the culture and use it in that spiritual context? Would it be that the spiritual context is brought to them through some other way? Would it be that they use that substance but not through that spiritual context, through some other context? Or would it be that they use some type of amalgam or something else instead?
It's difficult.
Yeah.
I think that maybe it's unpopular to say that, but I think that the genie is out the bottle and you can't put it back in a sense. If you consider, for instance, Santo Daime religion, it's not an indigenous religion, but it is a religion that uses a sacrament that comes from the indigenous peoples of the Amazon. So for me, it's okay in a sense. What I think is that, first, people personally have to be at least respectful, try to get to know those different cultures, be it Santo Daime or Huniquim or whatever Yawanawá and other cultures that use this substance, this sacrament, this plant, this sacred plant, use it respectfully and as an individual. And then collectively, we should think of ways of bringing retribution to these peoples that were the stewards of those plants that we inherited from them. So, and I don't see much of this movement right now, except for a few initiatives for retribution and compensation, and also discussions about intellectual property. But the use itself of this plants and substances, I think we have to leave it open. You cannot restrict it to indigenous use, I think, because, as I said, the genius is out of the bottle already.
Yeah, I want to answer a little bit on that. I think that the question is which kind of mixture is legitimate and who decides that? Who will be evaluating that? And I think one good thing is in Brazil is that we didn't allow the government to decide that. It's like in Brazil you need to have like a church. In a church like you have like a document that it's an official church, but a church may be anything. You may meditate, you may read, you may pray, of any denomination, and this, opens this field, this genie that's out of the bottle. And so what do we do with that? I think people are learning with each other, they are exchanging knowledge, they're bringing opportunities sometimes. Well, for a lot of people, indigenous people, they are meeting their own culture and evaluating and noticing that this is legitimate, it's valid, it's important. The white people are saying that this is important too, it's sacred, so it's important for them. So I've met shamans, pages, people that they didn't like their culture before, and after seeing all those white people noticing that this is interesting, they started to look to that in another way, so this is positive. But in another way, there's all this cultural appropriation. In Brazil, we have this neo-shamanic field, so you just play on shuffle many indigenous-inspired music, I don't know, and you call that a ritual, you know. So is that positive or not? In which aspect? But in the same way, there are indigenous groups, there are musical groups. They are not like shamans, they are chanas, they are people that they sing, and they are, well, going all around the country, and there are shows on there, not like rituals. And there people go there and play their music on Spotify and organize a ceremony. And I think I will not come up with an answer for you, which is the legitimate way. But what are the things that the indigenous people are getting from that? So which kind of reciprocity exists on that? People are really learning with all that. You can learn a lot, you can teach a lot, you can help people access possibilities. So, and that's good, but you can really just, dress up as an Indian and get money and benefit from that, and you don't give back anything to them. So I think we need to think about this aspect. What are people getting from all this exchange?
Yeah, I think in Mexico it's a very controversial topic because, for example, legally, there are these plants, for example, peyote or mushrooms, that are just legal for indigenous persons, no? But it's happening. I mean, there's a lot of like New Age or other groups or people that were using psychedelics and these plants since a lot of time before. And for example, some indigenous groups, they are not agree that, for example, not indigenous people use, but I'm a not indigenous person and I use these plants, and I think it's how you approach to this plant. And for example, not to repeat this cultural appropriation, because for example, I'm an anthropologist, and some people that studied with me, now they were like Wirarica people, and they are selling ceremonies in Europe or here, and I think that's not okay, because they are not. That's how you do things, but this is happening, and I think it's a tool for all kind of people that we could use, but we have to be really respectful with the plants and the traditions and the uses. But it's not new that non-indigenous people use peyote. So I was studying like New Spain or the colonial times, and people from Spain or mestizos, all people were using peyote. So that is a thing that is happening. It's like more the approach or be respectful here.
Yeah, I would like to mention that we were discussing about the intellectual property and reciprocity and reparation. I think that the importance is that, some indigenous groups give permission for non-indigenous to make these rituals. But these persons need to continue in these relations of exchanges, and need to, of course, include pay, and they don't exchange just money, but of course money is important, because if we want to help indigenous people to have autonomy, they have to have money, they need to have money. In a few weeks ago, we had an important conference in the National Museum of Indigenous People in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, with a lot of great leadership, indigenous leaderships in Brazil. And Fernanda Caigangue is the leader of this museum. We are in a situation with this government, with the Ministry of the Indigenous People, and a lot of indigenous participating in the government. And there were discussions about the intellectual property. because in May will be a meeting in Geneva in this situation of ONU, and they will discuss intellectual property, and the global people, it began with the Colombia, people from Colombia, and later Brazil and other countries from Global South, and discussions also with Australia, and they will try to create a treaty for the creation of serial rules about patents and the reparation the money will give you need to be paid for indigenous groups for creating patents or using biological contents from indigenous groups like genetic property and also indigenous knowledge related to the genetics. So they say it could be another step from the Nagoya Protocol, like these international discussions that have been occurring in the last decade. So I think that is important to have an international policy, to have strict rules about how we have to reparate and give back to indigenous groups. Because as Fernanda Caingangue says, if we receive what we need to receive, what is the right and justice for work to receive, we could buy the state of Mato Grosso do Sul and not be implored by the government to give back our lands. They could buy it. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
I think we only have time for one question, but yes, we have to be aware of capitalism too, for sure. Yes.
Hi, my name is Elsa. I'm from China, and I grew up in a British colony, so I, in so many ways, can like feel the energy of this kind of like living in common. And what was coming through for me was that recently I like found out that much of my experience is informed by the traumas of my previous generation, like my ancestors who were going colonized, and how we're reacting to the world today, like how Chinese are showing up in the world today with the world. And I'm curious, like what are the places of trauma that are asking for healing in the South? You know, I see the parallel of extraction coming back, this time is spiritual extraction, and how, like what is that dialogue on healing that you guys are receiving, you know, from your experience or even from France? And how could you share with us in the North? And also maybe what you hear about the North that is also invited to heal, so that this exchange is truly out of respect and love.
It's a difficult question because I'm thinking about the Mazatec people, and I think that the territory needs healing. For example, they share also like this genocide, ethnocide, and ecocide because the construction of a dam in the 1940s, and also like the end of the world for that towns. And I think that the territory is like very devastated. It's like a lot of deforestation, a lot of pollution, rivers are polluted. So I think it's a process that the Mazatecs have to do, have to think about it, and also to start actions because they have, as incredible as this will sound, is Mazatec have like this chip of progress and modernity, like in their own bodies, in their own way of life, like whiteness is inside them, like everybody here, because we are in that mindset, in that kind of existence. So I just hope that those forces of people that are like taking care of the territory, that are a few, should extend. And just to add about what Lígia was saying, I think that indigenous people are very interested in relations. You know, money, of course, we are used to just pay and we'll have no more relation with you. And we need to continue that relation, and also they're interested in expanding their networks. We need each other's. Thank you.
Well, I want to say that in one aspect, I think that even this idea of trauma, it's kind of a global north lenses on looking for the issues. I think in Brazil, mainly, I think the decolonization is still happening, and still in a more intense aspect in many ways. And people are discussing a lot about genocide, protection, access to money, to possibilities to try to maybe cut, end a little bit with all this colonization and genocide. As you say, we can see a lot of indigenous people dying, being exterminated, like the Yanomami people. So I think, but drinking ayahuasca and the revalorization of their own traditions, connecting back with their ancestrality, it's a way of, healing all that in a way, I think. So it's happening that way, I think.
I think that's all the time we have, folks. You're all on break until 11 or 12 o'clock. So refreshments in the lobby. Come back at the hour shot.
Thank you.